This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and the globe, representing the academia, business, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Ansami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Srdoc, economist and chairman of the think tank Adriatic Institute and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. This weekend, we are pleased to have as our special guest Dr. Daniel Kaufmann. Daniel Kaufmann is a senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. His areas of expertise include public sector and regulatory reform, development, governance, and anti-corruption. Previously, he served as director at the World Bank Institute, leading the work on governance and anti-corruption, where he pioneered new approaches to measure and analyze governance and corruption, helping countries formulate action programs. In the early 90s, Kaufmann was the first chief of mission of the World Bank to Ukraine, and then he held a visiting position at Harvard University. Dr. Kaufmann is a member of the Advisory Board of Transparency International, and during the next month he will take up a new post as president of the Revenue Watch Institute in New York.
In your study, you're using countries' programmable assistance. What kind of aid does countries' programmable assistance include? What's the purpose of that aid?
A footnote is very important, and it's to show that we have a lot of teamwork here at Brookings, like we had it before when I was at the World Bank. The expert who has been working on this new notion of country programmable assistance and measuring it is Homi Karas, who is a good friend and colleague here at Brookings. What we have done together is put together in the web a new tool to visualize all these new indicators and data. Country programmable assistance is something that he has created. My contribution are the governance-related indicators, including the ones you mentioned, but there are also others related to aid, but with the governance dimension, which we can discuss later. In Homi Karas' country programmable assistance, as opposed to just the conventional measures of aid, what he does, the most important thing he does, he nets out of those measures whatever the country doesn't actually receive for them to decide how to use it. Because a lot in what's counted in aid, for instance, when Italy decides to give aid, stays in Italy and it stays with the bureaucrats, or it's an administrative cost in the aid organizations, and the country never sees it. Yet it gets counted officially as part of overseas development assistance. So what Homi Karas has done is say, okay, let's be much more transparent and precise of how much aid actually the country receives, and it's totally untied so that they can use it in the best way that they see fit. And that's why it's programmable, because a country can program that assistance. So it's a different notion than the old conventional notion of overseas development assistance, which is driven by the rich capitals.
How effective is the aid dispersed by the largest donors? And also another question, how vulnerable is it to corruption and misgovernance in recipient countries?
Actually, Natasha, those two questions are very much related, because country programmable assistance does not really tell you whether that aid is effective or not, but it's a more accurate measure of how much aid the country gets and can use. Then the question is, well, once it uses it, is it effective? Okay, and that's where the work that we have done in trying to look at aid selectivity matters, because we find that a very large share of aid is going to highly corrupt countries. And there is evidence that when corruption is very high, then aid is not very effective. Now, not only there is a very high vulnerability to corruption of much of that aid that is given to countries, but unfortunately, on average, that vulnerability to corruption has increased over the past 15 years. So one could understand that, well, some of that aid has to go to countries which have had a legacy of corruption, so they're not going to be perfect. That's why one wants to help them. But there's still the question, why hasn't it at least improved over time? Now, having said that, sometimes it makes sense to try and help a very fragile state just coming out from a civil war. There's a regime change, so corruption can be very high. So we're not saying stop all that aid, but then we ask the question, well, at least the donors, in terms of giving that aid, are they putting it in places and working with the countries so at least corruption begins to decline? Mm-hmm. And the answer, unfortunately, is mixed. On average, that's not happening. However, some donors, like the UK, for instance, DFID, Department for International Development in the United Kingdom, one sees in the data that over time the countries are doing a little bit better. Why do I mention that specifically? And that it's not only the UK, there are a few other donors, is that because one should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and just because there is high vulnerability to corruption of the aid that is given nowadays to many countries, one should not stop that, but one has to ask the question, how do we do better in the future? And the fact is that there's some donors, and in some type of programs, they are doing a bit better. So yes, one can do it, but one has to be more selective.
We were thinking whether incorporating a commitment to accept foreign judges and prosecutors from strong rule of law nations and as an instrument, as a condition of foreign aid, and also perhaps at the next stage to introduce the reverse burden of proof, which has been shown, for example, in Hong Kong, where corruption was eliminated through confiscation of illicit enrichment, and very strong message sent that corruption will not be tolerated.
There are many initiatives and innovations in this field, which is a very difficult one. The first thing to recognize is how important the context is. So each country is different, and Hong Kong is a city-state which was relatively sophisticated. It had some preconditions that one is not going to find in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So one cannot think just because something worked in Hong Kong, it will work in Equatorial Guinea tomorrow. So that's the first point. Second, on the issue of bringing the institutions and the human resources and the experts from abroad, that has been tried in a number of places, and it's mixed. In general, the technical assistance record of donors of bringing experts has not been very successful. At the end of the day, the most important factors are going to be domestic, and it starts with leadership. So what kind of leadership the country has is absolutely crucial. How do they select and replace their leaders so they get good leadership is very important. How civil society gets involved and is allowed to have their political and civil liberties, we find that matters a lot. Transparency-related reforms. Now, a certain amount of know-how from abroad can be extremely useful. So to bring some judges, but to twin them with the local judges in terms of exchanges of skills and as part of effective technical assistance, not through a 2-week visit, but staying there. Those type of things in some contexts, they do matter. But if it's for Latin America, for instance, there was a successful experience with Spain that helped. One has to be sensitive to that. Just any type of person from the U.S. arriving in Egypt won't necessarily do the same thing as opposed to coming from a more similar type of background and culture. So one has to be very sensitive on the context and thinking more about twinning rather than replacing the local capacity. Well, because ultimately it's the local capacity, the local leadership, both in the public sector but also in the civil society, that is going to make the difference.
Dr. Kaufmann, you've really emphasized a very important number of points, actually. The importance of having principal leaders, actually, within these countries start making the right decisions. You have stressed the importance of freedom of speech in the media freedom and having civil society being more engaged and more robust. And those elements together certainly do make a difference in providing the necessary movement for real reforms eventually.
Do you have known examples where significant changes in governance happened in the short term?
Yes, definitely. I'm very grateful to that question, Natasha, because the old literature on institutional economics always stressed that the homework and the improvement can only take after many, many generations. That is extremely slow process. And yes, it's difficult. And yes, it doesn't happen overnight on 1 year. But what we are seeing in our data, following the governance indicators, that in a 5 to 8 year period, a country can make enormous progress. I don't know if you come originally from that part of the world, but a great example it's New Europe. And they have had their hiccups, and here and there are problems nowadays in Hungary. But what Slovakia and Slovenia has done, and Czech Republic, and those countries, in basically, I say it as a Latin American, over 1 decade period after the transition from socialism and the Soviet era, over that decade, they leapfrogged in terms of the quality of governance on over Latin America, on average. There's still in Latin America, there is a lot of variation. Other countries like Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica that do better. But on average, they used to be very behind. So the new countries of Europe, which were the former Eastern Central Europe, the Baltics. I was just in Vilnius in Lithuania and seeing how those countries look totally different nowadays, and they have evolved. Those are examples. Liberia, under Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, that she's just started recently her second term. The progress following the almost failed state nature of Liberia, civil war, the leadership, the awful leadership and governance of Charles Taylor. She takes over, and through leadership and changes, major changes and reforms, she shows a way in terms of improvements and control of corruption, effectiveness of the government, much more voice and accountability. All the dimensions that we follow, you see them very clearly in a five-year period. Latin America, we have seen it in countries like Colombia, for instance, my own country in Chile, ever since Pinochet leaves, 1989, for over 20 years, you see that progress. And then there are clear examples also in Asia.
Dr. Kaufmann, a few years ago, you codified the extent of state capture and legal corruption that you mentioned earlier. You did it through a survey of enterprises in over 100 countries. The extent of capture afflicting the U.S. was very high. And you say it not only rated well below other industrialized countries, but found itself among the bottom half worldwide. Could you kindly give us more details about it?
This work starts like in 2004. And that's when I inserted a number of very specific questions to enterprises, 10,000 in 100 countries around the world, through survey implemented by the World Economic Forum. And the traditional questions on corruption were giving us the numbers. What was the bribery for procurement in countries like the United States was existent, so it was not zero. It was not like Norway, which was very, very small, but it was like between 10 and 20% of firms would acknowledge that once in a while they had to make a payment to obtain a bid, a procurement contract. So it was, as opposed to countries like in Russia or a few in Africa or in Asia that the numbers went to 60, 70, 80%. But then, for a long time, I felt that we were not fully measuring corruption by just focusing on these bribery issues, on the most blatant forms of corruption. Because what would happen, and there was an observation I've written about, over time, as a country graduates to become industrialized and more sophisticated, the forms of corruption doesn't cease to exist. It's not eliminated. It just morphs, or it changes its form, and it becomes more sophisticated also and subtle. And and that's why I coined the notion of legal corruption, which is basically the gray area where, according to the laws at the time, what companies would be doing may have been kind of legal, but not ethical. A good example is what happened in the Wall Street financial crisis. It's not as if the CEOs did a lot of things that were totally illegal. They would be in jail by now. But it was basically around the rule of law, skirting the rule of law rather than totally illegal. And that was the notion of legal corruption. And more specifically, what we measured in what we call state capture, and that work started even earlier when I lived in Ukraine, and then related to the work on Russia and the oligarchs. We tried to assess to what extent a few very powerful industrialists, financial industrial complex, or oligarchs could influence the laws, the policies, and the regulations of the state, basically to unduly influence the rule of the game for their own benefit, what I have also called the privatization of public policy, whether paying bribes or through just their political power, their might, or like in the United States, through money in politics. And that's where when we inserted questions about the extent of influence of very powerful individuals and companies and corporations, and their ability to change the rules of the game for their benefit to the detriment to the competitive smaller and medium enterprise sector. And in that measure, which could be legal according to the laws of the moment, in 2004 the United States rated very poorly in terms of legal corruption and capture of the regulations. At the time, this is the mid-2000s, I was told that my data was wrong. Now, 2008, 2009, the crisis happens. Now nobody's saying that the data was wrong, so it's no more shooting at the messenger. But it's very sobering to see the extent to which there can be this enormous influence of money in politics, which basically shape the rule of the games.
Do you have any recommendations in order to eliminate most of the state capture? Obviously, there should be election reform or political reform done, but do you see other ways of how to deal with the state capture?
Well, the most obvious one is political finance reform. The problem right now in the United States is that that's politically not very realistic. But there are countries around the world, including my own, in Chile, where basically the TV stations are mandated to give free and equal advertising to all candidates, and there are all kinds of other rules and regulations that would not permit the same extent of influence of money in politics, although it's not perfect. Canada is much better. Some of the European countries do better than the United States. Overarching political campaign reform is badly needed. Unfortunately, it's not about to happen anytime soon because of the political environment. And then the other way of continuing to try to apply pressure is through more and more transparency and studying and disclosing, using the power of the media, yourselves and others, in basically exposing the vested interest, because for not for all, but for a good chunk of political campaign finance, you can find out who gives it to whom. And then if you know who gives the money and what that the giver is representing, to whom, which is the head of the Senate Committee on the Financial Sector, and they're trying to then influence legislation, you can start crossing all that type of information and find out the vested interest. Then you can look at the assets of these politicians and what have they benefited from. So you can start crossing data through this transparency and data analysis and doing investigative journalism and exposing some of the worst excesses which are part of this money in politics. In some countries, quite a bit of that has happened. And even here, there have been some senators and Congress people and state senators who have not only lost their seat, but they're sitting in jail because eventually some of the data comes out, and there is the possibility of exposure through NGOs, civil society, public interest groups, and the media having a watchful eye and forcing more transparency into the issue.